Eagles, in today's presentation, we're going to go over the Quantitative Analysis FRQ. Yes, I did say quantitative analysis. I know you're probably sitting there going, what am I in science class all of a sudden? No, Eagles, you are still in government class, and yes, it is called the Quantitative Analysis FRQ. All right, so essentially what that means is they want you to be able to interpret political data. So they're going to give you charts, maps, graphs, and they're going to have some political data on the chart, the map, or the graph, and you got to interpret it and answer some questions about it. Okay, now, for the AP test, you have 4 writing pieces, 1 argumentative essay, and 3 FRQs. Each FRQ will be a little bit different, so we're going to go through in this class how to write each one. Today, we're going through the Quantitative Analysis FRQ. By the end of the presentation, I hope you feel comfortable looking at some of these charts and these graphs, and I hope you're comfortable in writing the free response question, the FRQ, and exactly what I'm looking for when I grade these. Okay, so let's get to it. All right, so let's try to make it as easy as we can to understand. Quantitative analysis. What does it mean, right? Well, one of the skills for AP government is to be able to analyze political data. That's what it means. Quantitative analysis means you should be able to analyze political data. What will happen? Throughout the duration of this class, you'll be presented with political data within charts, graphs, and maps. And the idea is to learn to read the data, analyze it, and then draw conclusions. So one of the skills they want you to really get good at is just looking at a graph and understanding what is being presented to you. Sometimes you get these charts and these graphs and you glance over them quickly, you don't really quite understand what it's measuring. So that is a skill in itself, and really you don't even have to understand government politics to get good at this skill. It's just the ability to read data off of a chart, a map, or a graph. The next step of that is being able to analyze it, right? Look for trends in the data, and then the hard part, draw conclusions. That's when you've really enhanced your quantitative analysis skill, when you can take the data, analyze it, but then draw a conclusion from it. Okay, so reading data, analyzing it, drawing conclusions from it is the skill that we're going to work on in this class, and we'll describe this as the quantitative analysis skill. Okay, now, when we talk about how you do this, how you get good at this skill, it's about making connections. Making connections is the key. How does the data relate to the topics, and what conclusions can we draw? So to get good at this skill, obviously you got to know the content of the course. Understanding government and politics, understanding all the vocabulary and the terminology that we go through in class, understanding all the concepts will be the first key. But then you got to make the connection. How does the data that's being presented to you connect to the curriculum standards? That will be what we work on throughout this class. And then, of course, the higher level thinking will be drawing conclusions from the data. So it really is understand the content, relate it to the graph or chart, and then draw a conclusion from it. Making connections is the key. So let's get a little bit more specific on how you'll be assessed. You'll be assessed on this skill through multiple choice questions and free response questions, FRQs. For this presentation, we're not going to go over any multiple choice questions, but don't worry, you'll be assessed on this all the time throughout this class. Rather, this presentation is to focus on writing the free response question. So not only am I going to go over the quantitative analysis FRQ with you guys, but I'm going to go over some of the basic things I want to see in all of your FRQs with this presentation. So when we talk about this skill, you should be able to read the data, analyze it, and just a hint, when we analyze data, we want to look for trends in the data, and that will be kind of the key. Yes, everybody understands how to read the data, but when I say analyze it, what does that even mean? Well, analyze what? When you analyze something, an easy way to do it is to look for a trend that's being presented to you in the data. And And of course, the ultimate goal to get good at this skill is to be able to draw a conclusion from it. So reading it, analyzing it, looking for trends, and then being able to draw a conclusion. That is the skill we're trying to refine today. Now, yes, I'm going to focus on writing the free response question, but I think it'll be a lot more efficient if we go over or practice this skill of reading data, analyzing it, and then drawing conclusions. So I'm going to show you guys several pieces of data, 5, 6, half a dozen here, and we're going to just go through and practice this, and then I'm going to go over how to actually write the free response question. Okay, so here's our first example when we go through the quantitative analysis skill. Now, as I go through these examples, some of the things we may have already talked about in class, some of the things we may not have. Don't worry about it if you don't know it, because we will cover all these things. I just want to go through a few examples. So here's an example of a piece of data that you're going to get, and you got to be able to read it, analyze it, and draw a conclusion. All right, so let's go through the exercise. First, we got to read it, right? Okay, so you obviously have a map of the United States, and what is it telling us? What information is it presenting to us? So let's make sure we're aware of what the graph is actually saying. So this is public education spending, amount spent per pupil by state in 2014. And then over here on the left side, you have a key here of how much money each state spends on public education. All right, now, obviously this is going to be a federalism thing because states are going to be under federalism. The national government does their thing, but then states are allowed to do what they feel is best for their citizens in their state. So as you can see in this map, different states are going to allocate different amounts of money for public education. All right, so this is a pretty simple graph, and that's the first part of this skill is, can you tell me what's going on? Can you say that, yeah, the state of Utah right here is spending less than $8,000 per student, which is less than, a lot of other states. You're just being able to read it. And sometimes you'll get these questions in a multiple choice format, and they're really quite easy, where you're just explaining what's on the graph. And it's not a trick. They really want you guys to get good at this skill, even though it seems like it's an easy question. But then step 2 is being able to analyze it. Okay, can you take this graph, go beyond just reading it, and analyze what it's saying to you? Now remember, I said one way to help analyze these things is to look for trends in the data, right? So if I'm looking at this and I'm trying to analyze it, and if I want to see a trend, my eyes will immediately go right here to Idaho, Utah, and Arizona, right? And it looks like these 3 states are coming in very low at pure pupil spending. And then my eyes immediately would then go over here to the Northeast, and I see a trend here. I see that these northeastern states are really cranking it out in terms of pure pupil spending in public education. Okay, so I'm recognizing a trend in the data, right? But I got to take it another step further. Draw a conclusion. So what conclusion can I draw from identifying this trend and this trend? Well, it may be right, it may be wrong, but I'm going to draw the conclusion that in the Northeast, their states are really putting a high value on public education, whereas in this Rocky Mountain region, maybe not so much. Now, is that an accurate statement? Maybe, maybe not. I know that I live in Utah and that there's a lot more kids in Utah than, say, some of those other states, so maybe it's just the math, how we're actually funding quite a bit, but we just have more kids. Nonetheless, I am taking the data, reading it, I'm analyzing it, I'm looking for a trend, and then I'm trying to draw the best conclusion I can based off of my knowledge of government and politics. All right, so that's our first example. Let's do several more. Okay, next example. This seems like a pretty simple graph, but let's make sure we get it right by reading it. Percent of the budget by type of spending. Looks like we got a 40-year period there from 77 to 2017. All right, looks like we have percentages over here on the graph, and then along the x-axis you have the years, and then you have three categories: mandatory spending, the net interest, and then discretionary spending. Okay, so this is a budget piece of data, and of course the source down here gives that away, Office of Management and Budget 2018. But it looks like we have some data here that's telling us about the budget. Okay, so mandatory spending looks like it's a big piece of the budget compared to discretionary spending in 2017. Let's analyze this, right? Okay, now I just mentioned mandatory spending was a big part of the budget. What trend I can immediately recognize is that mandatory spending is getting bigger while discretionary spending is getting smaller, right? So there's a trend. Mandatory spending is growing compared with discretionary spending, which is shrinking. What conclusion can I draw from this? Well, I conclude that, as mandatory spending grows, discretionary opportunities are going to shrink. Now, what does that mean specifically? Well, some mandatory spending items are like Social Security and Medicare. Those are the things that must be paid out. And every year they're part of the budget no matter what. Whereas like education spending or spending on national parks, those things aren't mandatory. Those are discretionary. So as mandatory spending like Social Security grows, those other things like education and national parks, those are going to shrink. So that'd be the analysis I would have of this piece of data. All right, now the first two I gave you guys, I think we were able to identify the trends pretty easily. This one is a little bit different though. All right, first let's read it. It says international agreements and then presidential term. So you got number of agreements, looks like over here, and then along the bottom we got the presidents and their term. Okay, executive agreements are going to be in the black and just treaties are going to be in the gray. So this piece of data is giving us information on foreign policy and how presidents interact with other nations and our international agreements. Okay, so I've read the graph. Now let's analyze it. Looks like every year executive agreements are higher than the treaties. So even though we don't see that obvious trend, because if you're just looking at the executive agreements, it goes down, and it goes back up, and then it goes back down. So it's hard to find a trend just off of your first look, but there is a trend. And the trend is that every single president is going to have a lot more executive agreements than they are treaties, right? So that would be the trend I would identify in this graph. What conclusion can I draw? Well, clearly, based off of how many more executive agreements there are, it's a lot easier to get an executive agreement done than a treaty. And of course, the United States Senate has to approve of all treaties, whereas executive agreements are like executive orders. You don't need Congress to approve those, and thus presidents can easily implement an executive agreement. So that is the conclusion I draw, is that executive agreements are easier to implement than treaties. Okay, now this next piece of data has a little bit more reading involved with it, but you're going to get these all the time. So you just kind of take a deep breath and you make sure you understand what it's presenting to you. So we first need to read it, right? Okay, this one's saying America's trust in the mass media. In general, how much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media, such as newspapers, TV, and radio, when it comes to reporting the news fully, accurately, and fairly? A great deal, a fair amount, not very much at all. Okay, so this is how much does America trust the mass media piece of data. So over here you got percentage of respondents who have a fair amount or great deal of trust in the mass media. So it's showing you the percentage of how many people, how much people trust the media. And as you can see, when it first started in '96, the majority of people, had a fair amount of trust. But again, we need to analyze the data, right? Well, this is a pretty easy one to recognize the trend. It is trending down. The last data point is 32% of people have a great deal of trust in the mass media. So obviously, trust in the media is going down, right? Well, what conclusion can we draw? There's lots of conclusions we can draw from this piece of data. Off the top of my head, I would reference partisan division or hyperpartisanship, where essentially the media has become more polarized, and we can see that evidence with the number of bills being passed in Congress. So yeah, we're going through a time of political polarization where our two political parties are really divided on their ideology. Okay, so there's another example of data and analyzing it and drawing a conclusion from it. All right, let's see how we do on this one. First, let's read it. All right, top priorities for the president and Congress. Okay, so what are their top priorities? Looks like you got percentages and years again. And looking right here, you have 1,500 adults who were surveyed. So that would be reliable because it is a large number of people surveyed. Three data points: economy, jobs, budget deficit. Okay, so we can read the chart. Let's analyze it though. We look for trends. Now, immediately you think, oh, the trend is down, but I don't know about that because in budget deficit, it goes up and then it comes down and then it goes back up. So I don't know if that's a solid trend. Rather, I would go with the fact that the trend I'm seeing is that the economy is consistently the top priority and the budget deficit is consistently the lower priority of the three. And of course, jobs is right here in the middle pretty much the whole time. That's the trend I'm recognizing. Okay, so what conclusion can we draw? Well, my conclusion would be that when a politician or a president or a member of Congress is campaigning, they're putting economy first, and then they're putting the budget deficit last on their priority list. And as a result of that, we have pretty big national debt and it's climbing. So our deficit financing seems to be the conclusion I draw, in that we keep borrowing money rather than balancing the budget because economy is going to be the top priority. All right, let's do another one. I think this one's a little bit tougher than the ones we've gone over, but it's a good one. Let's first read it. So, ideological divide in constitutional interpretation. What the heck? What does that mean? Okay, what does it mean? Percent who say the Supreme Court should base rulings on what the Constitution means in current times, means as originally written. Okay, so I'm going to recognize pretty quickly that this is about living Constitution versus strict constructionist. Or in other words, when a judge makes a ruling, are they looking at the case and making the ruling based off of the current events of the time, right? Are they interpreting the Constitution as today's values would want it to be interpreted, right? Versus, are they interpreting the Constitution as strict as possible, strict constructionist, right, as it is written? So this is going to be an ideology piece of data. All right, so we've read it. Now let's analyze it a little bit. Okay, so means in current times, right? So this is the living Constitution side. And as you can see, Republicans are 29 to 69, Democrats are 70-26, and then you come down here, conservative versus liberal. Conservative, you're at 92 and 72. Liberal, you're at 70 and 83. So the trend we are recognizing is that Republicans are going to be more of a originally written group of folks, and you can combine Republicans and conservative thought together, and it looks like conservative thought, yes, likes the strict constructionist view, whereas the Democrat and mostly liberal and consistently liberal folks are going to want the Constitution interpreted with current times, right? Big part of the graph here. Okay, so this one required a couple more data points to analyze, but I think we've got the idea that the liberal ideology wants judges to interpret the Constitution based off of the current needs of the nation. It should be a living document, more fluid. Whereas The conservative side of the ideological line wants the Constitution interpreted by the courts as it was written, or the strict constructionist view. All right, that one was a little bit tougher, but what conclusions can we draw? Well, I conclude that if you have a Republican president, they are going to nominate a Republican judge. And if you have a Democrat president, they're going to nominate a Democrat judge. And then the Senate confirms these judges, right? So based off of this data, I can be able to tell you whether or not the Senate, depending on who controls the chamber, will approve or not approve a particular presidential court nominee. Okay, that one was a little tougher, but I'm glad we did it. So these are just some examples that we're going through to get better at this skill of quantitative analysis. Okay, so let's shift gears. I appreciate you taking a few minutes there to go through some example pieces of data, practicing reading them, analyzing them, and drawing conclusions. Now let's get to what this presentation really is all about, and that's how to write the quantitative analysis free response question. Again, 4 writing pieces on the AP test, 3 of them FRQs. Now there's a way I want you to write these, and we're going to go over that today. All right, for this FRQ, you'll be given data to analyze in the form of a graph, chart, or map, just like we went through over the last few minutes. And you'll be assessed on your ability to read, analyze, and draw conclusions. Can you do this skill? To show your proficiency in this skill, you'll respond to a 3-part question, a 3-part free response question. Okay, now when you're presented with this free response question, I want you to go through the checklist. All right, first thing you do is read the question. And you're probably there going like, well, no, duh, idiot, of course I'm going to read the question. Hold on, let me explain to you what I mean just a little bit. I want you to read the question, but I want you to identify the points on the rubric while you read the question. Oftentimes, students will kind of glaze over the question and they really don't read it, and they miss a point on the rubric because they just kind of skipped over it. So when I say read the question, I really want you to be thorough about reading the entire question, and I want you to identify the rubric, identify where you're going to score the points. The more you practice this, the better you'll get. Before you actually start writing your response to the FRQ, I want you to make a quick outline. Taking a few minutes to settle in your thoughts on how you're going to answer the question, to identify a few key vocabulary terms or to identify your point you want to make in a quick outline will really help you. Now on the actual AP test, feel free to write right on the test, and then whenever I give you a hard copy of an FRQ to answer, feel free to write right on it when you make your quick outline. Now here's one. This is a class requirement. Whenever you have not just the quantitative analysis FRQ, but any of the FRQs, you're required to respond in outline format. 1 bullet point for each part of the question. And in today's sample question, I will show you how that looks. You may have heard this in your other classes, but I want you to use the language of the question. Some teachers call it different things, but I call it parrot the question. A parrot is a bird that repeats. So even though it is annoying, Eagles, I know it's annoying, but I want you to be a parrot when you write these. I want you to restate the prompt or use the language of the question in your answer. And again, I'll show you how I'd like this to look. Okay, so I want to actually take you guys through a practice free response question, practice FRQ, and show you guys, how to make the outline and exactly what the question's supposed to look like. Okay, so here's our piece of data. We've already seen this today. You got a map of the United States, and it's public education spending, amount spent per pupil by state in 2014. All right, so here's your question. First thing we want to do is read the question and identify the points on the rubric. Okay, so 1A, identify the most common level of education spending by states in the Southeast. All right, now I immediately recognize this as an identify point. Okay, so this part A is worth 1 point, and it's an identify point. Whenever it says identify or define, then that tells us that they're not looking for much. They just want a really quick, straightforward answer. Answer the question and move on. All right, so part A is actually pretty straightforward, and it's an identify question. So, we're just going to answer it and move on to part B. All right, 1 point for part A. Part B. Describe a similarity or difference in public education spending by state or region as illustrated in the information graphic, and draw a conclusion about that similarity or difference. So right off the bat, I know that this part B, is worth 2 points. Okay, you have describe a similarity or difference and draw a conclusion. So when we answer this, we're actually going to break it up into 2 parts. In addition, I'm recognizing the word describe. If it says describe, analyze, or explain, we need to give more in our answer. It's not like these identification points where you quickly answer the question and move on. When it says describe, analyze, explain, or draw a conclusion, you got to give me more. You got to close the loop, as they say, and we'll practice how to do this. But part B is worth 2 points. So part A worth 1 point, part B worth 2 points. Part C, explain how public education spending, as shown in the information graphic, demonstrates the principle of federalism. All right, part C is worth 1 point. It is a 4-point rubric, and part C has explain here, so I know I need to give a little bit more. All right, so 1 point for part A, 2 for part B, 1 for C. Now that we've read the question, got an idea of what we're going to be doing, let's go through and create our outline, right? All right, let's start with part A. And we've already identified that it is an identify question, so we know we can be straight to the point. It says identify the most common level of education spending by states in the Southeast. Now, Eagles, this is the read the graph skill. And yeah, it's pretty easy. There's not much to it, and it's an identify point. We want to identify the most common level of education spending by states in the Southeast, right? So Southeast is right here. Over here on our key, 8,000 to 999. So we know that it's going to be a straightforward response. Now what I'm doing right here is I'm creating my outline. I like to circle trigger terms, and then I want to write off to the side some, how I'm going to answer it. You don't have to do it the way I'm showing you today. You can do it however you feel comfortable. But when I create my outline, I like to scribble right on the question or circle identify and then write the response right there. It helps me gain my thoughts before I actually articulate my response. Okay, so part A, pretty easy. It's an identify question. Let's move to part B. All right, now the first thing it's going to ask us to do is describe a similarity or difference in public education spending by state or region as illustrated in the graphic. All right, so this is a describe point, so it's going to be a little bit more, and it's giving me a choice, similarity or difference. Now this is the analyze the data part of the skill, right? We got to be able to analyze what's going on. And remember, when we analyze the data, we're looking for trends, right? And in this case, I have my free reign to pick whichever trend I want. So for the sake of this, I'm going to go with a difference in public spending. I'm going to go with the Southeast, since we already talked about that in part A, versus the Northeast, right? Because those two are different. Those are two different trends. So on my outline, I would kind of scribble Northeast versus Southeast. So when I start writing my response, I know that will be the first part of part B. But remember, part B has 2 parts. Draw a conclusion, right? So what conclusion can I draw from comparing these 2 parts of the country with their spending per pupil by state? Well, I'm going to make the assumption that education is more of a priority in the Northeast compared to the Southeast. Is that correct? Well, that's what the conclusion I'm drawing from the data tells me, so that will be my conclusion that I draw. Okay, part C. Explain how public education spending, as shown in the information graphic, demonstrates the principle of federalism. All right, so this map is just it just screams federalism as soon as I looked at it. And when I create my outline, I'm going to make sure I talk about federalism being the division of power, and I want to make the point that states know what's best for their state. In other words, each state gets to choose what they want to do with spending for education. And this is the great thing about federalism is it creates a division of power. The federal government will handle, national issues, and then each state has their sovereignty to handle what's best for their state. And different states, different cultures, some states are going to really want to pump a lot of money into public education spending. Some states may just have a different dynamic, and that's not what's best for them. So they're going to do something different. All right, so I've kind of scribbled that down, division of power, and states know what's best for their state. All right, so this is an example of how I kind of create an outline before I start actually writing the response. Okay, the hard part's over. We've read the question, we've broken it down, we've identified the points in the rubric, we've created our outline. Now we just need to articulate it. So the next part we'll go through is how to actually write the question and what it looks like. All right, so I want to go through each part of the question, show you guys exactly how it should look in outline format and parroting the question, using the language of the question. All right, so part 1A. Identify the most common level of education spending by states in the Southeast. Again, this is an identify question, so we're going to get right to the point. And down here, states in the Southeast are here, so it's 8,000 to 999. Now, whenever we respond to an FRQ, I want to make sure that you parrot the question and answer the question. A lot of times students don't, and it sounds obvious, but trust me, it's a common issue. Students don't answer what's being asked of them. You've got to make sure you read the question carefully and respond to exactly what they're asking. So every time you write one of these, I want to have you go through this 2-point checklist. Parrot the question and answer it what they're asking you. Parrot the question, answer the question. All right, first, parrot the question or use the language of the question in your response. Here it is. 1A, the most common level of education spending by states in the Southeast is, all right, so I've parroted the question, and then I got to answer the question, right? 8,000 to 9,999. Again, that seems very simple, and it is. It's an identification point, right? I do want to point out that we're doing this in outline format, so I would write 1A and then answer the question, and that's all you need for part 1A. Now let's move to the second part of the question, part 1B. Describe a similarity or difference in public education spending by states or region as illustrated in the information graphic, and draw a conclusion about that similarity or difference. All right, so this is a 2-part question. We're going to have a describe point and a draw a conclusion point. Again, our checklist, we want to restate the prompt, right? Use the language of the question or parrot the question, but then we got to make sure we answer directly what they're asking us, right? And again, outline format. Now this is what I wanted to show you guys. 1B1, remember, part B has 2 parts to it. So there's 2 points on the rubric. So whenever there's 2 points in one of these parts, I want you to break it up. So see how I have 2 parts here, 1B1 and 1B2? By doing that, it makes it easier on the grader to differentiate between your 2 points, and it makes sure that you answer both parts of the question. So part B worth 2 points, so I want you to break it up into 1B1 and 1B2. Okay, back to our response. Got to parrot the question, right? According to the graphic, one difference in public education spending per pupil in 2014 by region is, all right, so I parroted the question, right? Now I got to answer the question. Is that northeastern states have a much higher funding per pupil compared to the southeastern states. Remember, we identified that on our outline, that the Northeast has a lot more money being spent per pupil than the Southeast. So it's pretty straightforward, right? That is one of the differences. We could have picked several trends in the data, but that's the one we picked for our outline. Now we got to answer the second part of the question, right? Remember, parrot the question first. I conclude that this difference in spending could lead to, remember, draw a conclusion, right? I conclude that this difference in spending could lead to, answer the question, the northeastern states placing a higher value on public education when compared to the southeast. Remember, this was just our outline, right? And now we're articulating it and formulating our response. So parrot the question, answer the question, and in this case, the question had two parts, so we broke it up into two bulleted sections. All right, the final part of it. C, explain how public education spending, as shown in the information graphic, demonstrates the principle of federalism. It's an explain point, and so it's going to be a little bit more, but it's only worth 1 point, so we only need one part of the question, right? All right, our checklist. Parrot the question, answer the question. Public education spending, as shown in the graphic, demonstrates the principle of federalism because, so I've restated the prompt, right? Now we're going to answer the question. States are permitted to create and organize an education system that best meets their students' needs. Therefore, as shown in the map, all states spend money on education, but each spends a different amount per pupil. This demonstrates federalism, which is the division of power between the states and national government. Okay, now I want to point out something in part C. I've done a better job here of closing the loop, right? So I could have just said, because states are permitted to create and organize an education system. But I didn't stop there. I closed the loop by saying that best meets their student needs. Remember, in our outline, we talked about how federalism gives states the ability to do what's best for their state. And I made sure I related it back to the data, right? Because we're talking about students and education and pure pupil spending. So this is how you close the loop. However, I keep going. Therefore, using terms such as because and therefore in your responses will really help you close the loop. Oftentimes, students quite don't get there. And I say if you can use the word because and therefore to attach your points, it is very helpful. So if you have time to write more, yes, write more. And this is what I've done here. I said therefore, and again, related it back to the data. As shown in the map, all states spend money on education, but each spends a different amount per pupil. And I made sure I defined federalism, which was the key term in the question, right? Federalism, which is the division of power between the states and the national government. Okay. So, hopefully this presentation has helped you get a grasp of what to do with not just the quantitative analysis FRQ, but the quantitative analysis skill that you'll need for this class as a whole.